Gianna died in that car accident back in 2009, it felt like the universe had torn a hole through me. I remember the crash in vivid detail, how the world spun, the screeching tires, and the moment the airbag deployed, swallowing her up and leaving me helpless in the driver's seat. She didn't make it. And despite what the doctors said, there was no preparation for it. I couldn't let go. Even now, when I think about that night, the feeling is like a weight on my chest. It still feels unreal, and I didn't know how to explain it to anyone, especially our daughter, Olivia. Olivia was only 6 at the time, her face still so innocent, her mother's eyes staring up at me, eyes that once held so much life. Now they held questions, things she didn't fully understand. She had her mother's blue eyes, bright and curious, but there was something else in them too. I couldn't name it, but I knew it wasn't just grief. It was as if Olivia carried the same weight of loss that I did, but she couldn't express it the way I could. She was too young, and the thought of burdening her with the truth, with the reality of Gianna's death, made it all the more unbearable. I still loved Gianna deeply, even though she was gone, and I couldn't bring myself to tell Olivia the truth. She didn't need to know the details of that accident. Not yet. We left our old life behind, moving to a small house in the frozen mountains of Montana. The winters there were harsh, and I thought maybe the distance, the quiet, would help me heal, but it didn't. Life became a series of routines, fragile and dull. I worked long hours just to get by, and Olivia's days were spent with Mary, a college student I hired to look after her. Mary was kind, gentle, soft-spoken, and she had a way of making Olivia smile in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. It seemed like the perfect arrangement at first, but like everything else, that too started to unravel. It was on one of those bitter, lonely nights in the dead of winter when things began to shift. I woke up at 2 a.m., feeling a dryness in my throat. Reaching out to the other side of the bed, I found it empty. Olivia wasn't there. My heart skipped a beat. She'd been sleeping beside me ever since Gianna passed. She said it made her feel safer and more connected to the memory of her mother. My mind raced as I called her name softly, but there was no answer. I dragged myself out of bed and checked the bathroom. Empty. Panic gripped me as I moved toward the bedroom door, and that's when I saw her, Olivia, standing in the hallway, rubbing her eyes, looking at me like I was the one who had disturbed her sleep. "Where were you?" I asked, my voice harsher than I intended. "I went downstairs," she said quietly. "I heard Mommy calling me." The cold washed over me. "Olivia, your mommy isn't here anymore," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You can't go wandering around the house alone. It's dangerous." She didn't say anything. She just nodded and climbed back into bed, snuggling under the covers without another word. But sleep didn't come to me that night. I lay awake, listening to the house creaking and groaning in the bitter cold. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. It happened again a few nights later. I woke up to the bedroom door ajar. Olivia was gone. My chest tightened as I crept out of bed, trying not to make a sound. The house was deathly silent. Too silent. I crept down the stairs and stopped dead in my tracks. Olivia was standing at the far end of the hallway, her back to me, speaking in a voice that wasn't hers.
Mommy.
"Why can't you come inside?" Olivia whispered, her words soft, as though they were meant for someone else. I froze. A shadow, tall and unmistakable, loomed on the wall opposite her. It was a figure, a woman, or something that looked like a woman. It didn't move, it didn't shift, but I saw it. I couldn't tear my eyes away. My hand trembled, and the glass of water I'd been holding slipped from my fingers, shattering on the floor. Olivia turned around at the sound, her eyes wide and innocent, as if she hadn't even noticed the presence in front of her. "She was here," Olivia said, her voice accusing. "Mommy was here, but now she's gone because of you." I didn't know what to say. My stomach twisted. I couldn't breathe. I just picked Olivia up, carrying her back to bed. But I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the living room, every light in the house on, clutching a baseball bat as if it might protect us. But nothing could protect us from what was happening. The nights became a blur of unease, each one colder than the last. Olivia continued to speak of Gianna as if she were still here, as if she never left. I tried to ignore it, but it became harder and harder. Mary noticed it too. One afternoon, just before she left, she hesitated, standing in the doorway with an odd look on her face. "Olivia's been talking a lot about her mom," Mary said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's eerie. Are you okay?" I lied, the words feeling like lead in my mouth. She's just having a hard time. It's been a rough year. You know how it is. But deep down, I knew the truth. My wife, Gianna, was gone, but her presence lingered in ways I couldn't explain. And as much as I wanted to ignore it, it was becoming impossible to do so. Then one night, it all came to a head. I woke up again, but this time it wasn't the usual sounds that disturbed me. There was something else, something worse. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread as I forced myself out of bed and followed the instinct to check the front door. When I reached the front door, I froze. There she was, Gianna. Standing in the doorway, her hospital gown torn, her hair tangled and matted. Her eyes were hollow, empty, like a shell of the person I had loved. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. I staggered backward, my breath catching in my throat. The world seemed to tilt and spin, and I collapsed onto the floor, everything going black. When I came to, the house was silent. Olivia was still upstairs, fast asleep, but I knew that whatever was happening wasn't just in my mind. It was real. We left Montana shortly after. I couldn't stay there any longer, not with the memory of Gianna hanging over us like a dark cloud. We moved to Los Angeles, starting over and trying to rebuild, but it was never the same. I never explained to Olivia why we left, and as the years went by, she seemed to forget about the things she had seen. But I never did. I still think about Gianna sometimes, about how she died, how I couldn't protect her. And even now, on the cold winter nights when everything is still, I feel her presence. She's out there, waiting, and I wonder if she'll ever truly let me go. I used to be a city person. The buzz of traffic, the constant hum of life around me, it was what I had always imagined for myself. But that all changed after a traumatic experience that left me unable to handle even the smallest noises. At first I thought it was just temporary, but it didn't go away. My psychiatrist explained it to me. I developed phonophobia, a rare condition where everyday sounds trigger an overwhelming physical and emotional response. It's like the pins and needles feeling when your foot falls asleep, but in my chest, always there, like my body was bracing for something that never arrived. Every car horn, everyone slammed the door. It was as though I was being jolted into a state of panic. I had to get out. 3 years ago, I found a remote cabin nestled in the mountains of northern Minnesota. I won't give you the exact location, but it was isolated, tucked away far from the nearest road or any sign of civilization. There was barely any cell service, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. I figured this was my chance to escape the noise and rebuild myself. The peacefulness of it all, it was what I needed. It had to be. The cabin was small but sturdy, built with thick logs and a stone fireplace. It smelled like pine and something old, almost like a forgotten library, the kind of earthy scent that made me feel like I was part of the landscape. It looked like something straight out of a winter magazine, cozy, isolated, and untouched by the world. The nearest neighbor lived a good 20-minute walk down a snow-covered trail through dense woods. The path was narrow, barely visible from my front door, and I didn't meet anyone during my first week there. Instead, I soaked in the silence. I woke up to the sound of the wind whispering through the snow-covered trees, not sirens. At night, the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl. It felt like the world had pressed pause, allowing me to catch my breath. But then, on the 8th day, I heard a knock at the door. The cabin had no doorbell, so knocks were a regular part of life out here. I opened it to find an older man standing in the snow, holding a basket of homemade preserve. His name was Ralph. He was in his late 60s, tall and covered in thick layers of winter clothing, with a gruff face that looked as though it had been weathered by years of hard living in the wild. His eyes were cold, but not unfriendly. He introduced himself as my neighbor and explained that he lived further down the trail. His greeting was straightforward, almost curt. He handed me the basket and seemed to expect me to take it. I hesitated, but then I just took it. It was rude not to. Before I could say anything, Ralph stared at me for a long moment. It wasn't a normal, polite stare. It was the kind of gaze that felt like he was looking into me, sizing me up. He said, "Keep your firewood stacked high, your windows shut tight, and your wits sharper than your axe, and never let the snow fool you." The warning felt like he wasn't just giving advice. It was as if he was trying to prepare me for something that might be coming, something he didn't want to speak directly about. I nodded awkwardly and thanked him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He seemed to linger a moment longer than necessary, then finally turned and walked back down the snow-covered trail. I didn't know why, but I waited until his figure disappeared into the trees before I shut the door. The strange thing about the interaction wasn't the odd advice. It was the way Ralph had walked back through the snow. He left no tracks behind. I told myself it was probably just the wind blowing over the path, but the doubt gnawed at me. That night a snowstorm hit, heavier than I'd seen in years. The wind howled and the snow piled up quickly. I kept the fire going and tried to read a book, but the flickering lights and the heavy winds made it hard to focus. A few hours into the storm, the knock came again. This time it was louder, more forceful. I froze, my heartbeat echoing in my ears. The storm outside drowned out everything except for that knock, which felt like it was coming from all around me. I grabbed the flashlight and cautiously approached the door, peering out the small window. My breath caught when I saw Ralph standing in the snow again. This time his face was hard to read, but his eyes were wild. He said nothing before he blurted out, "There's someone in the woods. Stay inside. Keep the doors locked and don't answer the knocks. Not tonight." I opened the door a crack, the cold air biting at my face. "What do you mean? Who's out there?" I asked, confused. Ralph didn't answer. Instead, he glanced around, scanning the trees, and then told me to stay safe. Without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the storm. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to wrap my mind around what he had said. But the storm was too loud, and I couldn't see anything beyond the porch. After locking all the doors and windows, I spent the night listening to the storm rage outside, trying to shake the uneasy feeling in my gut. Hours passed, and I almost convinced myself it was just an old man being paranoid. But then, just after midnight, I heard it. A crunching noise. Someone was walking in the snow. It was faint at first, just the soft sound of footsteps in the fresh powder. But then it came again, closer this time. I stayed completely still, waiting. The footsteps stopped right outside my window. I held my breath, hoping it was just the wind. But then I saw the shadow of a figure standing just out of reach of the light, barely visible through the frost-covered glass. The figure was tall, too tall to be Ralph, and it didn't move the way he did. I ducked beneath the window, heart pounding, and stayed there, frozen. It wasn't until I could hear the figure walking away that I dared to peek again. The figure was gone, but I still couldn't shake the feeling. A few hours later, there was another knock. This time softer, almost tentative, but unmistakable. I didn't dare answer. The pins and needles sensation returned, a pressure building in my chest. I had to do something. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. I was barely able to speak through the fear, but I told them about the man outside, about Ralph's warnings, about everything that had been happening. The police arrived quickly, but by the time they got there, the cabin was quiet. No one was outside. They did a quick search around the perimeter, but they found nothing. The snow had covered any trace of footprints, and they said it was too dangerous to search deeper into the woods in the storm. When they left, I felt a pang of frustration, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I packed up my things and prepared to leave. But when I went to check on the cabin Ralph had mentioned, his cabin, further down the path, I found it completely abandoned. There were no signs that anyone had lived there in years. No tracks, no smoke coming from the chimney, nothing. The police just shrugged it off, saying that people who live in the wilderness sometimes disappear, and that they had no way of knowing who or what I had encountered. They didn't seem to care. I couldn't stay there any longer, so I left. To this day, I don't know who was out there in the woods, and I don't know if I'll ever find out. Some of my friends say it was a spirit or something else watching over me, but I still can't shake the feeling that the whole thing was something darker, something human. And that thought still keeps me up at night. I should have said no when my coworker Danny first suggested setting me up with her amazing friend. I laughed it off. Blind dates weren't my thing, and Valentine's Day was the last day I wanted to spend awkwardly getting to know a stranger. But Danny was relentless. She's funny, smart, and gorgeous, she insisted, nudging my arm. Come on, man. One dinner. Worst case, you get an awkward story. She had a point, and after a long shift watching couples clink glasses over overpriced steaks, I figured why not? Maybe I'd surprise myself. That was my first mistake. The second was not asking for more details. The restaurant was a small Italian place in River North, dimly lit with the scent of garlic and fresh bread hanging in the air. It was nice enough to set the mood, but not overly fancy. I got there early, texting Danny to let her know I was on board with this ridiculous setup. Then she walked in, Maya. She was pretty in a clean-cut way, with sharp cheekbones, dark hair pulled into a sleek ponytail, and red lipstick that matched her dress. She smiled, and for a moment, I felt like maybe this wouldn't be so bad. We ordered drinks, and the conversation started flowing. She was easy to talk to, laughed at my jokes, and asked about my job. I told her about working as a server, my weirdest customer interactions, the kind of small talk you expect on a first date. And then things got weird. You must be exhausted, she said, stirring her drink absent-mindedly. After last night, closing that late, I blinked. How'd you know I closed? She giggled. Danny mentioned it. That made sense, but something about the way she said it, casual, like she wasn't thinking about it, rubbed me the wrong way. I shrugged it off and asked about her job. She worked in marketing, or at least that's what she claimed, but her answers were vague. The conversation turned to family, and I told her about my younger brother and how he had just started college. Oh, at Loyola, right? My stomach tightened. I hadn't mentioned the school. Yeah, I said slowly. How'd you know that? She tilted her head, smiling like it was a joke. You posted about it. The picture at his dorm move-in is so cute. I stared at her. That picture had been posted months ago, buried in my feed. Something was off. I looked at my phone, trying to think of an excuse to leave. Then she mentioned a local coffee shop I frequented, describing my usual order with eerie precision. I laughed, assuming she had guessed. I've seen you there, she said. A lot. That was unsettling. I never noticed her before, but she described where I usually sat and how I fidgeted with my phone when waiting for my order. Then she mentioned my apartment building, the route I walked home after work, the laundromat I used. My stomach tightened. These weren't things Danny would have told her. This wasn't casual knowledge. I tried to change the subject, but she leaned in, resting her chin on her hand, eyes fixed on mine. You think you're hard to follow, she said, voice barely above a whisper. You're not. That was it. I needed to leave. I felt sick. The waiter came by, asking if we wanted another round. I shook my head, already standing. I should get going. Early shift tomorrow. Maya's face didn't change. She just sighed and leaned back in her chair. I knew you'd try to run. My stomach lurched. I stepped back, nearly knocking into the waiter. What? She stood slowly, smoothing her dress. You always leave places early. Always take the long way home. I tried to keep my voice steady. How long have you been watching me? She stared at me like I was the crazy one. You're overthinking this. I turned and walked out the door into the street, my hands shaking as I pulled out my phone, texting Danny. Who the hell is Maya? What do you mean? She said you guys were hitting it off. No, she knows things about me. Personal things. That's weird, but maybe she just saw stuff online. I wanted to believe that. I did. But deep down, I knew better. I changed my routine, took different routes home, and went to a different coffee shop. I thought that was enough. But then one night, after a late shift, I spotted a figure standing near my apartment entrance. At first I thought it was a neighbor, but as I got closer I saw the red dress. She wasn't facing me. She was standing still, staring up at my apartment window. My stomach twisted into knots. My first instinct was to turn back, but I was too close. She had to have seen me. I gritted my teeth and walked past, refusing to look directly at her, acting as if I didn't recognize her. She didn't move. Not even when I unlocked the door, not even when I slipped inside and bolted up the stairs 2 at a time. Once I reached my apartment, I pressed myself against the door, waiting, listening. Nothing. The next morning, she was gone. A few days passed, then a week, then 2. I started to believe she had finally given up. Maybe she got bored, maybe she moved on. I let my guard down. Then, one day, Danny pulled me aside at work. You're not going to believe this. Maya wasn't my friend. She was a regular at the restaurant, one of those customers you barely notice, the kind that blends into the background. She asked me to set you up after weeks of eating there alone. Danny, thinking she was harmless, agreed. But then Danny did some digging. Maya had done this before. She had followed another guy and inserted herself into his life. When he rejected her, she vandalized his car and left notes on his doorstep. It got bad enough that he moved across the country. I reported her to the police. They took my statement, but there wasn't much they could do. No crime had technically been committed. A restraining order wouldn't stop someone like her. So I did the only thing I could. I changed everything, deleted my old social media, took different routes home every night, and never agreed to a blind date again. I never heard from her again, but sometimes when I pass a storefront window or glance at a reflection in a train door, I swear I see her. Just for a second, and every time I wonder if she ever really left. I used to work as a nighttime security guard at a small industrial complex nestled deep in northern Vermont. The job wasn't glamorous, but it kept me afloat. I was tasked with monitoring the building's security cameras, patrolling the parking lot, and making sure everything was locked up tight. The complex was located on the outskirts of town, isolated on all sides by dense woods. In winter, the isolation became almost oppressive. The wind howled through the trees, and the snow blanketed everything in a suffocating silence. By 7 p.m., the offices would close, and it would be just me and the hum of the heating system. Sometimes it felt like the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. One night, during a fierce snowstorm that had started hours before, I was scheduled for an overnight shift. The roads had turned treacherous, covered in a thick layer of ice and snow, and only a handful of cars remained in the parking lot. I figured they belonged to employees who had decided it was safer to wait out the storm than risk driving in these conditions. The storm was relentless. The wind picked up and rattled the windows, and every so often, the lights would flicker as if the storm itself was trying to tear the building apart. My small space heater at the desk did little to fight off the cold that seeped into the walls, but I had my thermos of coffee and my phone to keep me company. It was quiet, unnervingly so. Around 11 p.m., I began my rounds. The building had 2 floors, offices and a break room on the upper level, maintenance rooms, and storage on the lower level. The main entrance had a large glass foyer that overlooked the parking lot. The wind howled outside, and the faint sound of the building's pipes creaking in the cold was the only thing breaking the silence. As I made my way through the dimly lit halls, the building felt like it was closing in around me. It always did on nights like this, when the snowstorm made the world outside seem so far away. When I reached the lobby, I glanced outside through the tall glass doors, just to check the parking lot. That's when I saw him. A man stood in the snow just beyond the reach of the streetlight, near the tree line. He wasn't wearing a coat, just a thin sweater and jeans. His head was tilted slightly as if he were listening for something, though there was nothing to hear but the wind. He didn't shiver. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the building with an eerie stillness, his eyes locked onto the glass doors as if waiting for something or someone. My first instinct was to dismiss it. Maybe he was someone who had been working late, waiting for a ride, but something about the way he stood there, so rigid, so unnervingly still, made my stomach turn. It was like he was waiting for permission to move, like he was testing something. I didn't like it. I reached for the radio clipped to my belt. "Hey, anyone still here?" Silence, just static. I knocked on the glass, hoping for a reaction, maybe a sign that he was just lost or confused. But he didn't respond. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step forward, not toward the street, not toward the entrance, but just closer to the building. The snow around him remained undisturbed. There were no footprints, no evidence he had walked there. The ground was completely smooth. That's when the panic started to rise in my chest. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding. There was something wrong about the way he moved, like he was testing the limits of how close he could get without being seen. I turned quickly, heading back to the security desk to check the cameras. My hands were shaking as I flipped through the feeds, desperately scanning for any sign of him in the parking lot. The camera feed flickered for a moment, then went black. When it came back online, he was gone. My mind raced. There was no way he could have moved that quickly. I had only stepped away for a few seconds. My breath hitched in my throat. My gut told me to check the lobby again, to confirm he was gone, but something held me in place. a primal instinct screaming at me that something was very wrong. Then, the motion sensor alarm went off. The sound cut through the silence like a knife. I clicked on the alert, my fingers trembling. The feed from the second-floor hallway appeared on the screen. It was empty, but then, at the far end of the hall, a shadow moved. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but no, it was too deliberate. Someone was standing there. I froze. My heart slammed against my ribcage. The figure was too far for me to make out any details, but I didn't need to see their face. I knew it was the same man. He stood perfectly still, just like before, his head tilted slightly, watching the camera with unnerving intensity. I grabbed my phone, my hands slick with sweat. My mind raced. Call the police. Call someone, anyone. I fumbled with the screen, my fingers slick with cold sweat. The call wouldn't go through. No signal. Panic set in, my breath coming in short gasps. The power flickered again, and in that instant, every single camera feed went black. The entire building plunged into darkness, the hum of the heating system the only sound breaking the silence. For a split second, it felt as though the building itself was holding its breath, waiting. When the lights returned, the feed came back online, but the hallway was empty. I didn't wait for another second. My instincts were screaming at me to leave. I grabbed my coat and my keys and bolted for the side exit. The wind and snow hit me like a wall, but I didn't stop. I sprinted through the parking lot, my heart pounding in my chest. My car was a distant beacon in the storm, and I fumbled with my keys, my hands numb from the cold. Finally, the engine sputtered to life, and I didn't look back. I didn't care how irrational it was. I was getting out. I called my supervisor from a gas station a few miles away, my voice shaking. At first, he was annoyed, asking why I was calling in so late, but when I told him what had happened, his tone shifted immediately. "Stay there," he said. "I'll send someone in the morning to check the building." I hung up, my mind spinning. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, my supervisor called me back. "There's no sign of anyone breaking in," he said. "No forced entry. Nothing's missing. But there's something else. Something odd." "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "They found something near the second-floor emergency exit," he said, his voice hesitating. Footprints. Bare footprints. Leading up to the door, I couldn't breathe. My body went cold. I never went back to that place. I quit the next week. They hired someone else to take over my shift. But every winter, when the snow begins to fall, I can't shake the memory of that night. I wonder if he's still out there, waiting, his cold eyes watching from the shadows.